we'd love to have you do that. And all that being said, if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'd like to introduce Bill Hartman. He has my memories of Bill Hartman go back when I worked in the school district. And he was the man on campus that you went to for any kind of maintenance issues or we worked on some recycling together and stuff like that. I remember back then he very much had and this is in no way a reflection of your physical size, but on larger than life stature on campus. It was always amazing the number of times that I said, well, who do I talk to? Well, Bill Hartman, of course. And so he had a career doing that, and then you retired and went
40 years, and I got bored and decided I wanted to go out to the nuclear plant and be a hand.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't work very well because after they found out my test on my score, they made me a foreman, and then they put me in supervision. And I actually refueled the reactor, but then I started glowing in the dark and my wife couldn't sleep, so I had to quit.
Which is, by the way, another connection that he and I have. My dad, when they were first fueling that plant, my dad actually went out and worked with the operators on the physics behind. They were all sort of Navy bullheads who knew a lot of technical stuff, but didn't necessarily know the science behind it. So Wolf Creek was interested in them actually knowing what was happening.
And I would like to add, one of my big enjoyments was going to the high school and as a substitute teacher and teaching history classes.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that.
Yeah. So, and that's speaking of which is where we're headed today is a little bit of history. So.
Well, the title of my presentation is the bogus election that generated the bogus constitution, which in my estimation saved the Union. Bogus election that generated the bogus constitution. Now I'm going to show you some family portraits just to give you a flavor of where I come from. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of family portraits, but John King, who was the carpenter supervisor at Emporia State University, did this. I don't know how many of you know John, but he's a good friend of mine and he's one devil of a good artist. Why do I show you this? I'm giving you a taste of Kansas in just a moment. Why I show you that is, do you see any family resemblance? That's my grandfather. He financed part of John Brown's effort to go to Harper's Ferry, which generated my interest in the presentation I'm going to make tonight. Well, the fact of the matter is, why I'm showing you this is the general attitude of Kansas was bleeding Kansas. This is my dad was born in 1901. Why am I showing you all these photographs that you don't know anything about these guys or not? But the reason I show you this is he married a Missouri Democrat. Not good in the family. Out of 6 brothers and sisters, he had 4 of them that would not talk to him for 10 years. Wouldn't talk to him at all. And that was because of the atmosphere in Kansas. And one of the things that will put you to sleep in a history class faster than anything is if you start talking about the Missouri Compromise, which generated the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Have you fallen asleep yet? It's boring, but it's what generated bleeding Kansas. And we're going to talk about bleeding Kansas and what happened to generate a bogus constitution. How many of you driven past Lecompton on the way to Kansas City? Everybody here has to. And out on the turnpike, you'll see Lecompton, where the Civil War began and slavery began to end. It's probably one of the most interesting museums I have ever been to. I've been up to it 5 times now. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what happened in Lecompton. Lecompton was the territorial capital seat. It was supposed to be Topeka. And there ended up being too many Democrats there. I'm not going to go into political rants and roles and so forth, but there ended up being too many Democrats there after Kansas became controlled by Republicans to end up being the capital. So they moved it to Topeka. What happened right across the Kansas River, is a small brick building, which is the headquarters of the Democratic Party. Those people couldn't count very good. And the reason I'm telling you that is when they had an election to determine whether or not Kansas would be slave or free, all the Missouri ruffians came across the river and started voting. Well, what happened is, as opposed to conspiracy theories about elections presently, there's very good evidence that 350 people more voted in that election for Kansas to be a slave state than lived in the area. So somebody didn't do very good mathematics, but it ended up with the result of the Constitution that was generated being a slave constitution. But let me read you a little bit about the flavor of Kansas. And I'm going to give you several anecdotal things about Kansas that aren't necessarily with regard to the bogus election and the bogus Constitution. But as we go forward, you might, I'm going to throw them in case you're interested. I typed this out about the Bleeding Kansas period went on for 6 years between 1854, when the Kansas Territory was opened for settlement, until Kansas was admitted as the 34th state on January 21, 1861. During this time, Kansas was a wild place. It was full of guns, anarchy. Settlers, rich and poor, came to build better lives, to speculate in land, to start railroads, to pursue criminal enterprises, to run from law, to promote the extension of slavery, which Lecompton was trying to do. To abolish slavery, to gamble, to jump claims, and some came just for the adventure. Well, what I just read sounds like an adventure by itself, doesn't it? But whatever the reason, come they did. Population was about 8,500 in 1855, jumped to 107,000 just 5 years later. The fraudulent 1855 territorial election handed the official federal territorial government to the pro-slavery faction. Lecompton was a pro-slavery capital of Kansas. The abolition free staters simply ignored the official pro-slavery government and the bogus legislation and set up their own parallel government. During the Bleeding Kansas period, the Kansas Territory went through 10 governors. In a short period of time, they had 10 territorial governors. It's too dangerous to be a governor very long. One of them actually had to sneak out of the territory in a disguise, which, if you know Southern history, Jefferson Davis, the president of the South, actually had to do the same thing, dressed up as a woman after he pilfered the Confederates' treasury of gold, but he got caught in a woman's dress. It didn't quite fit right. But our governor did the same thing here in Kansas. There were secret societies, local armed militias, and ad hoc armed partisans, bands of border ruffians, pro-slave, and jayhawkers, abolitionists. That was the jayhawkers. There were 2 outright massacres, at least 8 other documented paramilitary guerrilla engagements, and many outright massacres. And I lived up by the Potawatomi massacre, where John Brown, as a revenge to 257 people being killed in Lawrence, went after the pro-slave faction right outside my hometown of Atchison. And as a matter of fact, these people that I just showed you, we could not live in Atchison. The reason we could not live in Atchison was it was slave. Atchison had slave sympathy. And if you look at a lot of the antebellum homes in Atchison, which are quite beautiful, and that had slave quarters in the back that weren't slaves. And of course, if you know about the free state of Kansas, if slaves came north and once they hit the Kansas border, what happened? Once blacks hit the Kansas border, they were free. They were home free. That's why we're called the Free State of Kansas. This spark that started the fire was the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, if you want to fall asleep in a history class, start talking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act after the other acts that were passed. This law was the brainchild of Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who stood to personally gain from a coast-to-coast railroad and the expansion across the Kansas Territory. Well, that gives you a little bit of an idea with regard to what was going on in Kansas. That's a little preparation for what happened next in Lecompton. And I'm telling you, don't pass Lecompton. Go in there and go through the museum, because the oldest wood building in Kansas is in Lecompton. It's Constitution Hall. It's a wood building. It's terrifically interesting, and right across the street are the best homemade pies you've ever eaten. So that by itself is worth going. But they actually just recently had Robert E. Lee there doing a speech. And being the abolitionist roots that I am, I had to ask him, how dare you violate your oath of office with respect to the peaceful transfer of power? Does that have anything to do with what recently happened January 6th in Washington? It was very similar. Did you set the precedent for that? He didn't quite like that question, but he went on to and I did ask the question, and he went on to be very eloquent with regard to his main loyalty was Virginia, not the United States. He lied about his oath of office. Now, why am I telling you about? I told you I was going to give you little anecdotal things as we go along. He was actually, how many people knew Robert E. Lee captured and hung this man?
He captured him. He didn't hang him.
Yeah, but he captured him, which ultimately he
Yeah.
was hung. He was a party of that, but he was actually a colonel, I believe at the time.
Yeah.
And he captured John Brown and ultimately later became the leader of the Southern forces. I think that's an irony of fate. But Kansas was an interesting time then. The Lecompton Constitution was drafted by pro-slavery advocates and included provisions to protect slaveholding in the state and exclude free people of color from its Bill of Rights. And that ended up in the Constitution that went to Washington to be ratified. Now, what happened at the same time, we abolitionists said, the heck with that. We're going to set up the Topeka Constitution. And there was about 5 or 6 constitutions that were going on in Kansas at the time, I believe. But I'm not going to go over the Missouri Compromise or the Kansas-Nebraska Act, because that usually put me to sleep in my history classes. But the Topeka Constitution Convention met from October 23rd, November 11th to November 11th in 1855 in Topeka, Kansas, in the building afterwards called Constitution Hall. It drafted the Topeka Constitution, which banned slavery in Kansas, though it would also prevent free blacks. It would absolutely prevent free blacks from living in Kansas. Kind of hypocritical, isn't it? And I never knew that, because we were called the Free Staters, but we weren't really free staters to the point where we would allow them to live in Kansas. It was against the Topeka Constitution, which was in opposition to the Lecompton Constitution. I'm sorry?
Almost.
Yes, very close. So what happened, and here's the rather salacious part of this matter, is that what happened, Constitution from Lecompton went to Washington to be ratified for the new territory. Well, while there, here's a handbill went all over the country concerning a very salacious act that, in my opinion, saved the nation. And I don't know if there's a political scientist here, I need his help on this one, but here's what happened. The most infamous floor brawl in the history of the United States House of Representatives erupted as members debated Kansas pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution late into the night of February 5th and 6th, shortly after 1 a.m. Pennsylvanian Republican Grow and South Carolina Democrat Pete exchanged insults and blows. In an instant, the House was in the greatest possible confusion. The Congressional Globe reported more than 50 members joined the melee. Northern Republicans and Free Soilers joined the ranks against the Southern Democrats. Speaker Orr, a South Carolina Democrat, gabbled furiously ordered and then instructed the Sergeant of Arms Orr to arrest all non-compliance for stopping the melee. Members waiting into I've lost track here. Wading into the combatants, Grossnecker, the Sergeant of Arms, held the House mace high to restore order. No one complied. Wisconsin Republican John Bowie Knife Potter and Caldwell Washburn ripped the hairpiece from the head of William Barksdale, ripped it right off his head. And at that time, they held it up in front of the House of Representatives and said, look, I just scalped the SOB. And that ended up in all the newspapers throughout the world. And it was really a salacious act that did something very interesting to save the Union. And here's my point. When you know about that happening, it split the Democrat Party at that time. The Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats split their allegiance. Well, what happened? A brand new party called the Republican Party had a candidate named Lincoln. And he got elected with 30% of the votes. And that would never have happened without the Lecompton Constitution. I believe that's helped save the Union inadvertently. So with that, we'll pass these around, take a look if you want to. Pass it back there too. I've got an epilogue of President Abraham Lincoln. The Lecompton Constitution began the rift in the Democrat Party in the dusty streets of Lecompton that spread to the White House and the floor of the United States Senate, to Illinois' U.S. Senate campaign, and would go on to split the Democrat Party into factions, North and South. A constitutional Union party would place Tennessee Senator John Bell on their ballot, and Abraham Lincoln would be the second member of the Republican Party to run for president. I didn't know that. I thought Lincoln was the first Republican to run. He was the second, I guess.
Fremont was the first.
Fremont was the first, correct. I didn't know that. But it points to the fact that we got a president elected with 30% of the vote. That's because the Democrat Party split, because of the Lecompton Constitution. Now, after that, the war broke out, and I was somewhat, I made a scene in Charlotte on a tour bus. And in the memory, can you imagine me doing that? No, you can't, Barry. But on a tour bus, I'm touring around Charlotte, and the lady points out, there's Fort Sumter where the Civil War began. I said, lady, you're full of beans. There was one guy killed at Fort Sumter. One man. He was an Irish immigrant, and he was swabbing out a cannon, and he didn't swab it out very well, and it blew up on him and killed him. And that was the only man killed at Fort Sumter. There's estimates between 500 and 1,200 people dying in bleeding Kansas. In Lawrence alone, they killed almost 257 people or more. In the Civil War in general, they're now established that over 750,000 deaths have occurred in the Civil War, and probably 1.5 million Americans died or were wounded in that war. So that represented more deaths than all the rest of our wars combined. And basically, it started out in Lecompton, bleeding Kansas. So anybody believes the Civil War began in Charlotte,
You mean in Charleston?
Charleston, I'm sorry, has my sympathy. Now, when the war broke out, Lincoln had not formed an army. The Confederates were across the river ready to burn Washington down. One thing prevented it. It was the Spartans of Kansas. Kansas, more than 60% of Kansans joined to save the Union, which I'm surprised with. And there was a man by the name of Lane who formed a brigade, and he formed it in less than a week. And they did a forced march on Washington, and they surrounded the White House and the Capitol. They were all Kansas sharpshooters, and they saved it from being burned down. So that's a bit of history, along with the Lecompton Constitution, which I think saved the Union. That is somewhat interesting. Now, General Lane came back, and I bet a lot of you have heard about Lane University. He set up a beautiful university in Lecompton. It's still there. It's the main museum. There was $2,000 donated for the building of the Capitol. And it was supposed to have pillars out in front. And they reneged on the donation, but Lane University existed for about 15, 20 years and then went by the wayside. But he was the president of Lane University, and he's the one that saved the White House and Capitol building from being burned to the ground. All Kansans. So we have kind of an illustrious history with respect to saving the Union and saving the edifices in our main capital. What would you say, Mr. Political Scientist? Do you think that the Constitution had some in the Lecompton Constitution had some impetus in saving the Union from that scenario?
Well, you could argue saving the Union. I mean, it
Yeah.
hardened the positions that led to the Civil War.
That's
Of
right.
course, the Union prevailed.
That's right. Now, I let me see if I forgot anything else.
Bill, you mentioned the Missouri Compromise a couple times. That was 1820. I think you were completing that with the Compromise of 1850.
1854, yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
Which was basically the Kansas-Nebraska.
Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that was really what set the fire
Yeah.
loose. The state of the dates.
And what, in brief, what was the Kansas?
Well, they had a manifest destiny to be able to vote for their own disposition of slave
Popular sovereignty.
yeah, your own sovereignty, and it didn't.
Missouri was slave.
Missouri was slave from the 1820 decision.
Right.
But at that point, they had decided that the southern border of Missouri would be the northernmost border of slaves going all the way to the Pacific. And of course, the Compromise of 1850 turned that around by saying, now, the people can decide. And of course,
That was the 3630 requirement.
is that what the?
Yeah, 3630.
3630, whatever. Yeah.
That was the line where
Yeah.
slavery would be divided out.
But up until 1850, slavery was forbidden north of that line, except in Missouri and Kentucky and
The border
the
states.
border states. Yeah.
That's about it. And I did this on an impromptu basis. It generally takes me longer than this to make presentation, but I hope you found it interesting.
So elaborate a bit, Bill, on Lecompton. So you.
Lecompton now is a town of about 528 people, a population, and it's got the best pie shop in Kansas. So that's a reason by itself just to go Lecompton.
Been swallowed. As is true with a lot of little towns, is that as the metro that's
right.
it's really kind of been swallowed. I mean, like,
It's a better community.
you're in Kansas City, Kansas, and then you're in
Sorry.
in Compton, and then you're,
So there's this building, Bill, that's the old Capitol.
It's the old Capitol.
There's this lane, former lane.
The lane, which was supposed to be our capital of the state of Kansas. That the donors reneged on finishing it up. So they made it into Lane University, which stayed for about 15, 20 years.
There's also in Lecompton.
And that's also in Lecompton.
And that's now the museum.
And that's now the main, there's two very good museums. There's the territorial, there's this one here, which is the oldest wood building in Kansas, which is where the Constitution was written. And then there's the limestone building, which was going to be our state capitol, which is beautiful. And they do historic reenactors there, like Robert E. Lee or Lincoln or so forth. And I go to those and they're packed. They're really well attended. And they have people that know their stuff. And I really enjoy going up there to see it. And I passed it for decades. I passed going in there, just not thinking about being anything of significant in there. And The city is, another thing about Lecompton is you drive around a little city in Kansas that so many of them are dying on the vine. The little town is well kept and maintained and interesting.
I think Lauren Pennington, was he ever a part of this?
Oh,
He
yeah.
used to be one of the reenactors. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very good. I mean, because I grew up sort of knowing him as a kid, because he was in my parents' orbit. And I remember the first time I saw him, and I was like, that kind of almost didn't recognize him.
Remember a time when the kids were small, we were up in the Northeast, we took the kids to the Plymouth plantations and they have reenactors there. And the guy who was playing Miles Standish was talking to one of the little kids, asked where the kid was from. She said, Pennsylvania. He said, Transylvania, I've heard of that. He was staying in character.
How many of you have heard about the Lecompton Constitution? Did you know that it was the Slade document which split the Democrat Party? Kind of interesting.
Lane was not only a military guy, but then he starts the university.
That's right.
He's educated then.
Right.
He was not just.
That's right.
Elementary, maybe high school. At KU, I had looked into a lot of early history there as I did things, wrote for the museum pamphlets. And I found a large number of individuals had come and they were educated on the coast and they came to Kansas specifically for Francis Huntington Snow and others. He was a pacifist, so he went down to the Civil War and he handed out, wrote letters for people. But at the end, he came here because of the Free State and that position. So it obviously is an intellectual, there's a little bit higher level of education.
Kansas is one of the best educated states in the Union at one time. But I have a confession in front of my minister, and this is an absolute true story. This portrait, you know about this, don't you? Yeah, and you remember when it was there.
Yes,
This portrait was Preston P. Plum for 3 years. Okay, the reason for this was when they were remodeling Plum Hall, they didn't pay any attention to Preston P. Plum's portrait that was on the wall right outside the president's office. I'm walking through there and it's dusty and it's dirty and they're tearing down the walls and there's Preston P. Plum up on the wall. I said, that's not right. I took him home. Well, my grandfather had never been to college. My dad had never been past the 8th grade. And I thought, I'm going to take my grandfather to college. So I enlarged, I've got a better one at home. I enlarged it, made it look better. They kind of dressed it up, put it in a frame, and I hung it in Plum Hall. And it stayed there during the dedication. And I've got it, that's my confession. But the funny part about it is when we went up there for homecoming, my son was standing there and he looks up on the wall and he'd seen this. He looked up on the wall and he looked at me and he said, Dad, they looked up on the wall. And then the real funny part, like anybody knew who this guy was. My wife looked at me and says, you're going to get out of trouble. I took Preston P. Plum back, but he stayed there for about 2.5 years and nobody noticed it.
We talked a little bit about the timeline. I always, when I was teaching juniors in English, we always spent a good deal of time on the documents that sort of help found the country. And one of the things that I always sort of found fascinating is that we collectively have 1776 fixed in our mind as though we woke up on July 4th and said, well, it's time to pick the British out, whatever. And the process that's the end of the whole, I mean, not quite the end, because it was Constitution to write and whatever, but just how long, and when you're talking about these things that happened in the 1820s and whatnot, that how long these struggles are, and we have a tendency to try to fix a single point in time. We say, okay, the Civil War was 1861, boom, there we go. That's the, the end of the Confederacy, beginning of the end of the Confederacy. It's just not nearly as clean and simple as all of that. Right.
I know somebody who lives south and east of Hartford. adjacent to the wildlife refuge. And has, 20, 30 acres and, pretty rural and remote. And there was a stone fence that he was showing me around, a stone fence there. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What's it doing here? Well, this used to be, something else, and supposedly the slaves built it. So my question is, is there any information about slavery and immediate area?
It was not to have existed, and Kansas was a free state.
Well, it was,
And-
but obviously there may have been.
Well,
Yeah.
here's the other thing. Along that line, slavery existed by the orphanage trains. And the thing about Kansas orphanage trains was back east, the orphans were put on the trains
You talked about that.
and they were sent out to Kansas. And at every stop, they were paraded out and presented to the people who might adopt them. Adopt them baloney. They used them as slaves. And
Some were like that.
in some cases. And most of the time, they were looking for free labor for the
Most
farm.
of the time, they were handlers.
Yeah. Yeah.
Missionary like people that might have.
So,
Well, there was some draw of money in that process.
That's right.
I mean, even if nobody adopted, then there was usually a collection at each of the stops. And,
but that existed for about 20 years, so that's very similar to slavery, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it is.
Before Kansas became a free state, prior to its admission to the Union and all that, there were slaves here.
Oh, yeah,
They were brought in by people, and of course,
the Spanish particularly.
Spanish, and of course, the Southerners who tried to overpopulate and do the Lecompton competition.
Do you know who the second largest group of slave owners in the United States were? Cherokee Indians.
Yeah, it's probably so.
How do you get reparations out of Cherokee Indians? For their slaves, but they were the second largest group of slave owners.
I think it's so fascinating that Lawrence and Lecompton represented the opposite poles in that, and today, of course, they're 10 miles apart.
Yes.
Lecompton is basically a suburb of Lawrence,
Yeah,
and
and-
there's this state, hundreds and hundreds of square miles,
And
thousands.
interestingly, at one point, we paid Republicans to come settle land, but we didn't pay the Democrats to do it
Yeah, of course.
at one time. And then there was something called Chapter 11. Has anybody heard of that in Missouri? Chapter 11 around the Kansas City and St. Joe area was any Democrat who supported the Confederacy lost his land.
It's order number 11.
Order number 11. That's order number 11.
Order 11 was the anti-Semitic one that Grant put out.
Yeah.
That's a different.
I still think.
General Order 11 was Grant's saying that no news, and of course he had to rescind that later, but.
Yeah. But they did lose the property if they sided with the Confederacy. So. I did this quickly, so I appreciate the corrections.
It's not all in our history,
No, it is it?
and 1776, but I do believe there were some good people that thought the king wasn't so bad. And
One third,
mentioned that.
1/3 of the population.
Yeah,
My-
so history is written by the victors. And we don't always remember that.
My grandfather did the genealogy of his wife's ancestry. My fourth great grandfather was a fellow by the name of George Gilmore, who was a Presbyterian preacher in Connecticut. And because he had Tory sympathies after the war, he was forced to flee to Nova Scotia, where most of his descendants still remain.
Yeah.
Except for a few of us who came back to the States.
Well, it's always, I've always sort of been fascinated by the formation of our country in the first place, because we have this sort of ideal that the country was founded on the basis of freedom of religion. And it wasn't. I mean, if you just look at the division of all the states, we're like, okay, I mean, my last name's Calvert. We come from Maryland because we were Catholic, and just literally go up the seaboard. And
Some states prohibited
yeah,
Roman Catholicism.
right, and that's what I'm saying. When I used to teach the Crucible, the Salem witch trials, It was fascinating how all these little hamlets around Boston each had their own very exclusive religion. I mean, it was, you couldn't live in town unless you were a slave. If you were not a part of, the Quakers or the Puritans in the case of.
I really like the
Salem.
Shakers.
Yeah,
They had an interview on public radio about what was the demise of the Shakers? The lady says, we don't believe in sex.
yeah.
She said that right. Public radio.
The second coming is late for Tuesday, so.
That's what she said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but it was, I do think it is just like 1776. I mean, we really get these sort of fixed notions that very much cherry pick, sort of like you were saying, sort of the victor's story from the midst of all the rest. And of course, you talk about history books. Now they're rewriting history books in Florida and Texas for.
trying to whitewash,
Yeah,
literally whitewash
yeah.
the whole story. Now, white folks are all good, everybody else is all bad. Sickening.
Plus, of course, you're woke and white, and then you're.
Well,
Then you're the enemy.
yeah, right, we're traitors.
Well, I would encourage anybody that hasn't been to the Lecompton Museum to stop in there and be surprised. It really is a nice museum. So that's about it.
Right. Well, thank you so much. For all the. I really do.
That Southern Carolina Senator want Daniel Webster nearly to death.